So in this video, I'm going to share a very small story with you guys. So actually, I do the work of a tailor part time. So once what I did was I had to, so I had contacted Mr. Khali, and he had actually asked me to make a cover for his table. So it was this kind of a table, and he had asked me to make a cover for his table. So obviously he lived far away, and I could not visit his place directly. So I could not see how big the table was. But yeah, I would always call Mr. Khali and ask him how big his table was. But he's a wrestler. He's not a mathematician, so he could not tell me very accurately. He could not measure very accurately and could not tell me. So what I told him was, okay, Mr. Khali, what you do is you take your hand and just tell me how many. So this is called as hand span, right? If you know. So this length is called a hand span, and this is called cubit. So I told him, either you measure in cubits or hand span. So he said, yeah, I'll measure it in hand span. Okay. So I said, yeah, that's all right. So just tell me how many hand spans. So how would he measure it? He would take his hand span like this. So that's one, then two, and maybe three. So in my hand span, this would be three hand span for me. Okay. So similarly, I told him, Mr. Khali, please tell me the length and breadth of your table. So this is a true story, huh? Don't laugh. So I told him to measure the length and breadth of his table, and tell me that how many hand spans is that, and I'll make a cover for it. He said okay, and soon after he told me that his table was one hand span wide and two hand spans long. So the breadth was one hand span, and the length was two hand span. I said okay, fine. So what I did was I took my cloth, okay, that I used while tailoring, and I measured one hand span breadth. I mean, I made it rectangle, right, to cut out. That was one hand span thick, wide. So the breadth was this much, and the length became this much. Okay, so I just took this much length and this much breadth, and I cut that piece of cloth out, and using all those measures, okay, I just made a few decorations, and I sent him the piece and said your cover is ready. Soon he came to a shop and beat me up. Do you know why? Well, the cover did not fit his table. How can that happen? He said that the cover was very small. But how did that happen? He told me his table was one hand span wide and two hand spans long. And I just did that, right? And I'm a very experienced tailor. I could not make a mistake. But what went wrong here? Then I realized when he came and slapped me that his hand was this big. And the problem with that was when he measured the table, his table was actually this much. But his hand is also this much. So the width was one hand span for him. But for me, that is two hand span because I have small hands, obviously smaller than Mr. Khali. So from that day, I learned a very great lesson and a painful lesson that never use these types of measures. Why? Because if you meet a person like Mr. Khali, his hand is this big, so his hand span is also this big, but your hands are smaller, and your hand span is also smaller. So yeah, there's no uniformity, and if you try to communicate length using hand spans or cubits or any other such measures, you will always run into problem, and maybe even get beaten up by people like Khali. So never use these kind of units. And then okay, so this was the kind of problem that people were facing in olden days, when there were no other units, so they were using hand span and all, and there were a lot of problems, just like Mr. Khali's problem. And what they came up was, so they devised a new system. So what they said was, it's not exactly what was happening, but I'll just give you an idea. What exactly happened was, so they said that okay, let's do one thing. Let's decide something that is fixed, not our hands, because everybody has different hands. So let's take something that shall remain fixed. So what somebody did was, so obviously who's the most special person in a country? The king, right? In olden days. So what the king said was, I'll do one thing. You measure my arm length from this point to this point, and you will call that thing as one unit. Okay, so even hand span is a unit, cubit is a unit, but you will call this as a unit. And they started using that, but then obviously the king died, and instead they could not keep his skeleton, right? So what they did was they maybe took some piece of rod, and that is equal to that king's arm length, and then they named it. Obviously they can't name it king's arm, so they named it a meter. and that is how a meter came into existence, which is this much, almost. Okay, and now there's a rod that is maintained which is 1 meter long. Obviously, 1 meter is completely a random number, so the king might be shorter king, so he would have a smaller meter. But if the king would have been somebody like Khali, you would have got a long meter. So there's nothing special about the meter. It is just a random tukke wala number length that is being taken as 1, and using that, then we measure different lengths using that. But because 1 meter is same for every person, which is equal to that specific length, there are no disputes such as the dispute of me and Great Khali. That's why we use SI units, or standard international units. Okay, and we don't use handstand and cubits.